Welcome everybody to our 181st Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. It's a great pleasure to have Pete Groothuis from the Appalachian State University presenting competitive recruiting imbalances between NCAA conferences. In terms of all the usual announcements, you'll be aware from the reminder sent out. Hopefully you're getting that. If you're not and you want to be on the list, part of the team, let me know. You'll have the list of the forthcoming talks that we've got running up to Christmas, and also details about academic conferences that are starting to take shape in 2025. There is a WhatsApp group for these Roses Talks if you want to join that and be part of the discussion that sometimes is deprived because the Teams function in chat, the chat function in Teams sometimes doesn't work as well as might be hoped. Let me know if you want to join that. And also, I'm starting to think that I'm moving away from Twitter or X, as it's called. And so if you are on this blue sky place, let me know as well. And I think I might start setting up there. And so it'd be good to see a few people there, and perhaps we can generate a sports economics presence there. I don't want to take away any more of Pete's time. Pete, are you happy to take questions as you go along?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, fantastic. Well, the floor is yours, Pete.
Okay, this work, competitive recruiting imbalances between the NCAA conferences, is probably deep in the weeds in terms of college sports in America. There's a lot going on right now in college sports, and I guess I'll start with how this project came about. At App State, we have something called a senior seminar course. And sometimes students come up with really interesting ideas. Adam Houston was one of those students. I'm at Appalachian State. We're I guess you'd say, a regional institution. And we are a member of the Sun Belt Conference, which is a smaller conference. Well, I got to explain what conferences are, but we're a smaller school, and because of that, we tend to get fewer high quality recruits at our thing, and sometimes we're even called cupcakes when we play the bigger schools. Occasionally, and App State occasionally does beat a bigger school. I mean, one of our claims to fame is early on we beat University of Michigan. So there is a big difference in terms of competitive balance in the NCAA. And Adam was interested in this, and he wanted to figure out a way, is there a difference between Power 5 conferences and non-Power 5 conferences, the big schools versus the small schools? Dennis Ganay, was the professor of this. And after the course was out, he contacted me and said, hey, you know what? Adam put together this unique data set. Maybe it's publishable. And the three of us got together and looked at it and said, you know what? It might be better than just looking at the difference between the big schools and the small schools, but all the 10 conferences to see if there is a recruiting differences between conferences and why that might come about. And so that's how the project started. And we have submitted it, and right now it's at a revise and resubmit stage. So at certain points, I might ask you to address some of the referee comments as we proceed with this paper. So the main research question is there a competitive imbalance between NCAA conferences in terms of recruiting? Once again, because this is a European audience, I decided to kind of outline the presentation and add a little bit more than I would to an American audience. So I decided to do an outline in terms of questions. These are the questions that we're going to answer throughout the presentation. And the first question is, I think, the big question. How did $1 billion entertainment business end up in a system of higher education? Because it is weird that we have, I mean, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's part of colleges. And then what is the role of conferences in the NCAA athletic system? Does competitive imbalance exist in the NCAA system? Actually, the NCAA itself says that it does. How do colleges recruit talent? What's the data we use? What are the results? And what are the conclusions and insights from our research? And then at the end, talk about the changing nature of the colleges going on right now. Recently, there's been a lot of different colleges moving to different conferences. We also have a lot of athletic transfers. Very seldom do one. Well, at one time, if you were recruited by a school, you stayed at that school. Now we see people moving yearly or almost all the time between conferences. And then we also now the Supreme Court says that you well, actually they've said two things. First of all, you own your own name, image, and likeness, and so you can make money even though you are technically an amateur. But now the Supreme Court says, well, not only that, the NCAA is a cartel, and you can start paying athletes. So at the very end, we'll talk about some of these new changes. So let's see how we go. So why is a billion-dollar industry in higher education? Some of these I've actually used before at a different presentation, but I thought they kind of help set the stage. Athletics are the front porch. This comes from Scott Barnes, who was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I thought it was a really good metaphor to kind of set up. Athletics truly is the front porch of a university. It's not the most important room in the house, but it is the most visible, and what comes with it is the opportunities and responsibilities. So a lot of times people only know the university by the sports teams. See if I can. So how did sports and universities end up together? Sports have a long history of connected to the university. Um, for instance, University of Michigan, Minnesota have been playing football all the way back to 1892, and they have this thing called the Little Brown Jugs that go back and forth between the two. The first NCAA basketball tournament was in 1939, so there was a lot of sports. College sports have statewide and national-wide interest. Kentucky, that's where I got my PhD. I was crazy when I first got there. I was surprised at how big college sports were compared to professional sports, and it occurred to me that Kentucky has no professional sports teams, so almost everybody sees the University of Kentucky as their big sports team to follow. They even call it the Big Blue Nation. Cloutenfelder in 2015 studied obituaries and found that people actually identify with the sports team. I just drew one out. She enjoyed family traditions, knitting, and Penn State football. Let's see. Now I got to figure out how to get to the next slide. Huh. This is a new system for me. Oh, I see. Yeah, okay, here we go. Not only is there a big connection between the two, college sports is a big business. This is where I said is $1 million industry. The NCAA basketball tournaments in last year raised 1.29 billion for the NCAA. The top athletic revenues, the Ohio State University brought in $252 million in 2023. Also, we find that conferences, particularly the biggest conferences, have negotiated TV contracts with ESPN. The Southeast Conference, which we're going to discover is the biggest conference, the network generated $720 million in 2019. I know it's even more than that now, which is $45 million per school. Not only do we see big revenues, we also see big costs. Top paid football coach Kirby Smart at Georgia made $13 million a year. A lot of times, the highest paid state employee is a football coach. The top basketball coach is Bill Self, who is at Kansas, makes $9.6 million a year. The stadium cost was $450 million for just a football stadium. So we realize there's high revenues, there's high costs. So why is it connected to the university? I found this article back in 2018 that I think really helps explain why football and colleges are connected. This article of the Journal of Labor Economics said students place a high value on consumption amenities, such as extracurricular activities, sports, fraternities, sororities, when choosing a college. So they're not only looking at academics, they're looking at the social life. They say that the university can be thought of as a country club that not only provides academic services, but also consumption amenities to students. They further found that for every dollar spent on academics, a university spends between 45 cents to 80 cents on consumption amenities. So we realize that sports might be one of those consumption amenities that draw students to the door. You would think, with all the revenue that comes in, that sports would be a cash cow for the universities, bringing a lot of money that they could use for academic programs. However, Sanderson and Siegfried said that's not the case. And this article from 2017 says, how has 100 of the top 128 schools persuaded their universities and trustees to continue devoting scarce resources, funding, and intercollegiate sports when incurring losses? Why don't they deploy these monies elsewhere? And they said, well, there are different ways that we might see that this may bring benefits to the university. First, it might attract greater appropriations from the state. Second, these may boost private donations. And third, high-profile sports teams and other campus amenities may attract more students and enrollment. And so it could be that that's what's going on. Previous research. What we find if we look at previous research, that it might actually be some of the case that we do see sports success increase student to the university. Thoma and Cross, all the way back in 1998, saw that championships increased applications. McAvoy, football win percentages increased applications. Humphreys in 2007, athletic success increased alumni giving. Pope and Pope increased applications and test scores. I guess I don't need to read through all of those, but we saw some positive. Eggers, myself, and Parker, another undergraduate student, saw that upsets increased applications and enrollment. And then recently, McFarland, another undergraduate student, saw that football win percentage increased applications at Group of 5 schools. So we see that there is some connections, but very seldom do the benefits outweigh the costs of those. So now we need to kind of go into the conferences itself. So this research that we're looking at today looks at only the top division in the NCAA. The NCAA is divided into actually 3 divisions. NCAA Division 1, the top division, NCAA 2, smaller schools, and the NCAA 3, which is truly amateur. You can't even give scholarships, and it's really the smaller schools. And then the NCAA Division 1 is divided into 2 categories, the football bowl subdivisions and the playoff subdivisions, although it's kind of a misnomer because the football bowl division now has a playoff. We're only worried about the football bowl subdivision, which is the biggest one. And in this division is broken down into 10 conferences that have been named the Power 5 conferences, that consist of the biggest schools, sometimes called the flagship schools of the universities, such as I grew up in Michigan, so I'll use Michigan as my example. The Power Five schools in Michigan are the University of Michigan and Michigan State, which are the two biggest schools. The group of five schools in Michigan are Eastern Michigan, Central Michigan, Western Michigan. These are all regional schools that are in the same subdivision, but they are in the group of five conferences. So what are the different conferences? In the Power Five, the biggest schools, is the Big Ten, which is also a misnomer because it's now a whole lot more than just 10 schools. Actually, I should step back for just a second. Initially, all of the conferences were divided up by regions. The Big Ten, when I was growing up, consisted of primary Midwest schools. So it'd be Ohio State, University of Michigan, Purdue, that's in Indiana, the University of Indiana, Wisconsin. And I think the reason they did that is because initially it was hard to get between schools, and so region made sense. So we had the Big Ten in the Midwest, the Pac-12, which is the Pacific Athletic Conference, and they consisted of UCLA, USC, all West Coast schools, Oregon, of course, and then the SEC is a Southeast Conference, and that consisted of schools in the Southeast. Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Mississippi State, Alabama. And then there's the Big 12. The Big 12, which is kind of just the Roman numeral there is their symbol. And that was kind of the Texas, Oklahoma State in that area. And then the ACC is the Atlantic Coast Conference, and it consisted of North Carolina, Duke, along the Atlantic coast. Nowadays, of course, it has changed drastically. And if you look at the Big Ten now goes coast to coast, all the way from Rutgers, just out of New York, to UC. Part of the old Pac-10 is now part of the Big Ten, or I guess they just call it Big now. And that's they have added USC and UCLA, and I believe Oregon and Washington as well. The group of five conferences consist, once again, it used to be regional schools. We had the Mid-American Conference, that's the MAC. The middle one, which is the Mountain West, the Western schools. Conference USA, which is kind of in the southern area. The American Conference, and the Sun Belt Conference. The Sun Belt Conference used to be primarily in the South. App State is now part of the Sun Belt, even though I wouldn't consider myself in the Sun Belt. But it used to be the Sun Belt would be the southern schools such as Georgia State, Louisiana State, and the like. And if we look at revenues, you see a big difference. And this is why Adam was so interested in his senior project between these two types of conferences. If you look, I don't have the exact date of this. I think it's about 2019. And so if we look at, it's even more so bigger today, but if you look at the Power Five schools, we see that the revenues that are generated, the Southeast Conference generates the most, the Big Ten next, and then all of them tend to dwarf the amount that the group of five get. The group of five gets very little compared to Power Five schools. And then if we look at national championships of this, we find that since the start of our data set in 2014 and 2015, since 2014 and 2015, the top four schools have been able to compete for a national championship. And that's kind of where our data set started. During this period, 6 out of the 9 schools have been from the Southeast Conference. So we see that Southeast Conference dominates the national championships. If we look at it further back, we find that Southeast generally was once again the biggest conference for football, over the last 20 years. 42% were won by the Southeast Conference, 17 by the Atlantic Coast Conference, 8% by the Big Ten to Pac-12 and the Pacific 12. Notice that none of the Group of Five schools ever were in the playoffs. Interestingly, this year they've made the playoffs bigger. They've gone from 4-team playoff to a 12-team playoff, and one of the 12 teams must be from a Group of Five schools. So once again, like I said, we're in a changing nature of college football. When we, like I said, this is a revise and resubmit paper, and initially we didn't have anything in the paper, even though our title had competitive balance. They told us, wow, why aren't you talking about the competitive balance literature? And so I went back and we went back and dug out the competitive balance literature. And the first site I have not, first, everybody seems to say the first thing. But I can't find a site for it. I need to see if I can find that. The NCAA itself argues that amateurism creates competitive imbalance. I'm sorry, creates competitive, not imbalance, competitive balance. And the story that they tell, or the explanation, I guess it's a story or an explanation they tell, is that because of amateurism, people aren't going to go, or athletes are going to go to schools that will pay them the most money because they're not making money. So it's going to be probably distance from home. So if you grew up in Michigan, you'll go to a Michigan school. If you grew up in Alabama, you're going up to an Alabama school. And so their story is that amateurism will create competitive balance because talent is distributed nationally across the board. However,
can I just interrupt
yeah,
you?
go ahead.
Steve has got a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Pete. Sorry to interrupt, but I think especially for the European audience, it would be useful for you to talk from an economic as opposed to a legal or conceptual perspective about what the literature and you mean by competitive balance. The European courts are vague on it. The U.S. Supreme Court has been pretty clear, and I know Brad Humphreys and a lot of other people have some work in this area, that competitive balance means a competition that enhances fan appeal because it is more balanced. There are philosophical and other reasons to support competitive balance, even though it hurts fan appeal or does not create as an appealing sport. So I wonder if for purposes of your paper, you could set the stage by clarifying what you mean.
I've always had difficulty, I must admit myself, when I even teach the course about the term competitive balance, because I realize a lot of times it's not, fans don't come necessarily to see the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis as much as superstars. I mean, we see that in sports all the time, where right now in the WNBA, whenever Caitlin Clark comes to town, attendance goes up drastically. So I've always had a little trouble with competitive balance, but the whole idea behind it is competitive balance increases attendance, increases viewership, and therefore increases profit. And once again, that seems problematic when you look at the NCAA, because that's an amateur sport. But I guess it creates revenues for the university. There has been a lot of research on competitive balance that is looking at the NCAA in general. Like I said, almost all of the papers start with the idea that the NCAA itself argues that amateurism will create competitive balance, and therefore we get much better competition, and people are wanting to go see that uncertain game. But all the way back in 1998, Eckert said that the NCAA cartel discouraged competitive balance, because if I'm a star player, I want to go on a team that's winning. And if I'm on a winning team, that winning team stays a winning team because they draw the talent down the road. It's hard for me on a losing team to compete with a winning team because nobody wants to come to my school because they prefer going to the other school. That's what Eckert found. Kirk in 2005 started to notice that competitive imbalance within a league created churning. And he defined churning as going between conferences. So if I was in a smaller conference and I was a winning school, I would move up to a bigger conference. Matter of fact, Appalachian State, where I'm at, did that while I was here. We were actually in the smaller conference. We were in the lower division, the FBS playoff subdivision, and we moved up to the biggest division and then joined the Sun Belt, which is a group of 5 school. And then occasionally we'll see a group of 5 school move up into a Power 5 conference. So we see churning, and Quirk makes the argument that it was competitive imbalance in the conference itself. Depkin and Wilson found that NCAA sanctions encourage competitive balance. They said that when there's cheating, where I'm paying students, of course, athletes, this is before the NILs, that you might actually encourage players to come if you pay them money. And so NCAA sanctions encourages competitive balance because we don't see as much malfeasance. Competitive balance and then Fort, using time series analysis, discovered that competitive balance was consistent over time. And then in 2019, Eckert once again returned to this topic and tried to compare the NCAA to the NFL and found that they were essentially the same. The competitive imbalance in professional sports was the same as the competitive balance in the NFL. I hope that answered your question. In this particular case, you go ahead.
Yeah, Pete, I was going to say, just so I can understand where you're going with the paper, all these papers are descriptive. Is something create more competitive balance or they don't create competitive balance? And they take the objective is to study competitive balance. And that's fine. And if that's what your paper is doing too, I know none of those papers study whether competitive balance actually makes fans is an optimal revenue maximizing strategy, an optimal profit maximizing strategy, an optimal welfare maximizing strategy. So it's fine with me if you say that my paper is just going to be in this literature, but I just like to know where you're headed.
Actually, this wasn't part of the original paper. Mostly we were trying to look mostly just at the recruitment of talent. And one of the referees mentioned, hey, you know what? You put competitive balance in your title. You better go back and tie this together. In essence, we're saying, I guess I see this as a background that there isn't competitive balance. And our paper kind of shows that that's exactly right, that there are reasons why we don't see this. And it may be conference affiliation itself that diminishes competitive balance. So I think it's kind of tangential, but an important piece of literature that we fit into to some extent. Really, what we're looking at is factors that contribute to the recruiting of talent, and that recruiting of talents affects competitive balance. Drummond, so factors that contribute to recruiting success. What we found was Drummond, Lynch, and Platinia found that media exposure, on the field success, conference affiliations, athletic proximity to the university, and AP finish all had a positive effect on recruiting. Now, what they were doing is they were looking at recruiting of individual players. Mirabal and White found that highly or mid-range recruits value historical success of a program, the head coach, stadium capacity, facilities, and coaching expenditures. Evans and Pitts found that a successful basketball program can positively impact football recruiting. Harris in 2017 found that many recruits found that athletic resources could be the deciding factor when selecting a university. And then we found that recruiting success, not surprisingly, determines on-field success. Langford et al. Found that recruiting significantly affects the team performance, and team performance significantly contributes to recruiting results. This kind of gets back to that positive feedback. If I'm Alabama and I win all the time, I recruit the best players and I continue to recruit the best players. Bergman and Logan found that within school variation in recruiting quality is an important determination in the probability of appearances of lucrative bowl games. So this is a second thing that they asked us to add to our paper. And if you could help me with this, this would be great as well. What is the model of the recruitment cycle? And all previous papers see this as a two-sided matching model. First of all, it's kind of a sequential game. College moves first and makes athletes the offer. So I'm the college, I make athletes the author. The athlete has a bunch of offers in front of them, and then the athlete accepts the offer from the university. Almost all of the papers, I don't make it mathematical at this point. At this point, I kind of just give the basic idea that if I'm an athlete, I'll choose a university over another if the expected benefits are greater. I'm going to go to the school that gives me the greatest benefits. And some of the things that might affect those benefits are athletic success, which might be win percentage, AP, being in the top 25. I want to go to a school that's in the very best. I want to go to a school that has about the athletic resources and possibly conference affiliation. My competition matters. I want to go to a conference that has the best teams so I can show myself as the best player within that conference. And here's where we put the data together. Like I said, Adam, he and his friends got together in a senior seminar course and put together a really high quality data set. And they decided instead of looking at instead of looking at an individual athlete, he would put them together in what the US calls a star system. And this is he and his friends. I told him I'd put it in this presentation because he and his friends put this data set together. And once again, the main research question is there a competitive imbalance between NCAA conferences in terms of recruiting? And what he looked at was, like I said, instead of looking at an individual athlete, he looked at three groups of athletes. A five-star athlete is their skill places them in a realm above and beyond the peers expected to contribute to their college program significantly. Sometimes they also say that the five-star recruits are guaranteed to be put into the NFL down the road. They are NFL quality athletes. Four-star athletes still possess exceptional levels of athleticism and skill. Nonetheless, they're not quite as good as the five-star athletes. They're still considered blue chip. And then three-star recruits are not to be on par with the athleticism of four and five-star recruits. However, they're still considered to be could be untapped potentials. And if we look at the number, what we see is there are very few five-star recruits, about 35 per year. And then when we look at 4-star recruits, they're in the hundreds, and then 3-star recruits, there are a lot more. So 5-star recruits are the smallest percentage. 4-star recruits, there's more of them, and then 3-star recruits, they're more common. They're divided up. Now, the other variables that we use to try to understand what determines. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Can you just clear something out for me? For these athletes, these are from high school,
Yes,
presumably?
they're from high school. Yes.
Right. So is there any trading between colleges? Can a big conference college acquire an athlete from a small conference college? Is any of that trading going on?
You mean ones that were at the school?
Yeah.
Oh, that's at one time that did not happen. Now it happens all the time.
Okay.
We see players moving up and down. If I'm on a big, if I, and so this is only looking at the recruiting from the high school level. But things are at one time, if you were recruited and you wanted to move schools, you had to sit out a whole year before you could go back. Now you can, I guess you can go from school to school at least once, maybe twice. And so we see a lot. So this is only recruiting at the high school level. Does that explain it?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. And somebody else had a question. I see somebody else got a hand up.
Pete, let me just clarify for the European audience. These players are currently not considered employees. So they have no contractual relationship with the team. So they aren't acquired. They are just recruited away from so if a player stars at Appalachian State and Penn State wants to get them for the next year, Penn State just offers them a scholarship and then they come to Penn State.
Yes.
This is what is interesting for the future, because this is in flux, is first, to the extent that the American college athletics changes and you start getting contracts, then you start getting some of these issues about, well, suppose Appalachian State signs a 3-star recruit who turns out to be a superstar, but he's under a 3-year contract to Appalachian State, and now Penn State wants him. Then you start getting into the issues Rob Simmons raises. Alternatively, if you take Stefan Szymański's view of player restraints in European football, the current NCAA model is potentially instructive, because if FIFA and UEFA are not allowed to enforce any contractual restrictions, and at the end of a season, any football player is free to move to another team with no penalty or liability on them or the other team, then you will get something that is closer to the current model of annual transfer portals, as they call it, in American football. So I just want to put that in sort of comparative perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Like I said, it's such a changing nature. I mean, it wasn't too long ago, like I said, you had to sit out a whole year. If I wanted to transfer from App State to Penn State, I could do that, but I have to sit out 1 year to do that. Now it's not that case. Like I said, I don't believe you can transfer continually. I think you only have certain amounts according to the NCAA, but we see a lot of transfers. In terms of this article, we're only looking at the recruiting at the, I guess you'd say the freshman level beforehand. And the variables that we use to control for athletic quality are the total wins, whether you're a playoff team, whether you're a national championship, whether you're in the top 25, and then conference affiliation, back toward the top, and then coaching change. Some have found in the past that the coach matters, and so if there is a coach, it was a change. And what we found is about 23% of a head coach changes each year, and 20% are in the top 25. Really small, only one team makes the national championship. The playoff is a small number, about 3%. College affiliate, okay. And then we also have 5-star recruits per team. There's only about a quarter. 4-star recruits, there's about 3 per team. 4-star recruits, about 3 per team. 4-star recruits, about 14 players that are recruited. And now our empirical model. Our empirical model is the number of star recruits, 5-star recruits, 4-star recruits, 3-star recruits, depending upon a vector of conference dummy affiliations, a vector of athletic success, and whether a coaching change. Turns out, because it's a count model, we use the negative binomial to estimate our results. Now, we report our negative binomial regression results using something known as the incident rate ratio. I discovered that not everybody is familiar with the incident rate ratio. The problem with the negative binomial sometimes is if you don't it's hard to interpret the coefficient as a magnitude. A lot of times you only talk about the sign and significance. The incident rate ratio helps explain it in details. And I felt that it was worth, because the referee in our paper said that, hey, this is kind of new to us. Can you explain what an incident rate ratio is? And the incident rate ratio comes in that an incident is the number of counts per year. So that's incident. So the rate is the number of incidents per year. And then the incident ratio is the per season given the university characteristics divided by the baseline. So actually it turns out to be a ratio between the university in question and the baseline with the characteristics. In our case, we use the Southeastern Conference as the excluded category because they're the most successful category, and we want to interpret our results in terms of the SEC. So in terms of how to explain that incident rate ratio, suppose that my incident rate ratio comes out as a 1.23. That says that the university has a 23% more incidents, in this case recruits, than the other university. If the IRI is less than 1, it says I have 17 less recruits than the baseline. And then if the incident rate ratio is exactly 1, we're saying that there's no difference between schools, that they have the exact same number of recruits. And so now let's look at the results. And if you look at the results, what we find is all of them are under 1. Now, this is actually just half of the table. The first part of the table, so notice it says continued. This is only the conference dummies. And then in the first column, we include only the conference dummies. In the second set of regressions, we include not just the conference dummies, but also athletic success. And in the third column, we also include coaches changes. And so probably I'll talk mostly about the third column because it has all of the control variables. Notice the Big 12, the Big 10, the Pac-12, and the Athletic Coast Conference, the top 4, are all in the Power 5. Notice all of theirs are below 1. And then if you look at all of the group of 5 schools, the AAC, the Conference USA, the Mid-American Conference, the Mountain West, and the Sun Belt, they're all 0. So if we're going to try to interpret this, and then if we look at the next part of the table, we find that wins matter, Whether you're a playoff team matters, and then national championship is below 1. So let's kind of take a look at it in terms of these results. Once again, the admitted category is the SEC. In comparison to teams in the SEC, a team in the Big Ten has 68% less matches. In the Pac-12, they have 60% less matches. The ACC has 70% less matches, and the Big 12, 75% less matches in the Category 5. So one thing we do find is that the SEC is the school that's loaded with the most five-star category. If we look at the other schools, like you said, the group of 5 schools never recruit a 5-star athlete. Given that there are only slightly over 35 5-star in any given years, we find that the majority of them tend to go to the SEC. We do find that win percentages making the 14 playoff increases the 5-star recruit. Surprisingly, winning the national championship reduces the number of 5-star recruits. I don't really have an explanation for that, but there are also, it's actually, that magnitude was less than making the playoffs. So if you make the playoffs, you still are having more than the others because you're in both categories. If we look at 4-star recruits, we find that there is still, well, actually, the Big 12, the Big 10, the Pac-12, and the ACC, they're still all less than 1. And then if we see the American Athletic Conference, it has it's also less than 1, and then the other ones are all pretty close to 0. So 4-star recruit. Okay. So second half of the table. I keep always forgetting the second half of the table. The number of wins, winning the national championship is negative. Number of wins is positive. Being in the top, I should say when I say positive, should be above 1. The top 25 were above 1, and coaching change doesn't matter. So what we find is compared to the SEC, the Big 10, the Big 12 have 50% less 4-star matches, while the Pac-12 school matches 45% fewer, the ACC 60% fewer than the SEC school. For the groups of 5 schools, all schools recruit about 95% fewer 4-star athletes than the SEC. So once again, we see that the SEC is loaded with the top recruits. We find that the team win percentages, winning a conference championships, and being ranked in the top 25 also increase the number of 4-star recruits. And like I said, coaching changes doesn't matter. 3-star recruits, this is the more common. The first thing we notice is the Big 12, the Big 10, the Pac-12, and the ACC all recruit. All those numbers are above 1, suggesting greater number of recruits for these schools. If we look at the group of 5 schools, the AAC and down, well, actually the AAC is above 1, the American Athletic Conference, but the Conference USA, MAC, the Mountain West, and the Sun Belt are all less than 1, which means that they recruit less 3-star recruits than the SEC. And what we found when you look at 3-star recruits, being a playoff team actually is less than 1. Being in the top 25 is less than 1. And coaching change is marginally significant and less than 1. So a Power 5 conferences match more 3-star recruits than their counterparts in the SEC. The Big 12, the Big 10, and the AC school match about 20%, and between 20 and 25% more three-star recruits, and the Pac-10 matches 16 more three-star recruits. Most, and then if we look at the, like you said, most of the group of 5 schools match fewer three-star recruits compared to the SEC, except for, like I said, the American Athletic Conference, which matches 13% more recruits. During this time period, they were considered the most powerful team in the group of 5. The Sun Belt matches, like I said, 28% fewer. The MAC 23% fewer. Conference USA 16% fewer, and the Mountain West 20% fewer. So if we look at talent distribution, the SEC gets the most. The Power 5 gets the next most in terms of overall recruits. Three-star recruits, I guess we make the case. Well, I'm sorry, three-star recruits considering participating in the playoff and being ranked the top 25 teams are strong predictors of recruitments, both less than 1. We make the argument, although we don't, that it could be that these three-star recruits aren't going to the SEC because they've already been filled with 5- and 4-star recruits. Coaching state is a negative effect on recruiting three-star talent, lowering recruiting by 5%. And our conclusion, what we discovered is, I guess I should have put it up here, is there doesn't seem to be competitive balance in the NCAA. We do find athletic success matters. Head coaching change really doesn't matter except for three-star recruits. But the big result is conference affiliation matters. We find that if you're part of the SEC, even though you might not be the top school in the SEC, you still have a recruiting advantage. So if I am at Vanderbilt, an SEC school that tends to be one of the weakest in that conference, I might still have an advantage because of that. And that finishes up the presentation. But I did want to mention that we're in a changing nature, and so I'm not sure where things are going. The U.S. Supreme Court just had a antitrust, and they said, yes, the NCAA is indeed a cartel, and things you can start to pay athletes. And I think that's where one of the comments that came in about contracts. One of the things we do know is money matters. The SEC has the highest number of money. And because of that, we've seen a lot of conference realignment. There's also been the playoff expansions. And then I can now pay players for name, image, and likeness. We now know that there are some groups of individuals who get together, donate money, and then use that money to pay players for their name and image and likeness if they just do a few things. And then, like they said before, I can't remember who had stated that, we now have open transfers between schools. So if Appalachian State recruits somebody that of a three-star recruit and then turns out to be really good, it could be easy that they go to Penn State. And that kind of finishes this up. Are there any questions?
Thanks very much, Pete. Really interesting talk. Certainly educational for myself. Yeah, we've got plenty of time now for questions and comments. Yeah, I see someone's given a team's round of applause, so I will also do that if I can remember how to react. There we go. So there's your team's round of applause. Questions and comments from the audience. Steve, go ahead.
I wanted to pause, let the Europeans come in, but I think also interestingly from lessons possibly from Europe, you note athletic success matters and conference affiliation matters. So the question is, which matters more? And this is relevant on both sides of the Atlantic for an long-standing question. If you support Penn State and Tottenham, when Ohio State or Arsenal are in a major match, do you support your fellow member of your league because it will make your league better? Or do you oppose your rival because you're a much closer direct competitor to them, and therefore you don't want them to succeed? So to use the American model, for purposes of recruiting, does Penn State want Ohio State to win in the playoffs because then it makes the Big Ten Conference look better? Or is that a modest increase? And what Penn State would really like is for Ohio State to fall on its face, and then we could recruit more players away from Ohio State.
Yeah, that could be the case, but I almost think it's more to do with revenues, because our media contracts, instead of negotiated, particularly for football, are not, well, I guess, are negotiated by conferences. So the SEC has an SEC network. The Big Ten has a Big Ten network. And I think and of course, the more eyeballs that you see watching the games, the bigger the TV contracts. And I think the SEC, because of their success, has the biggest contracts. But that kind of gets back to what you're saying, is if I get the biggest contracts, I'd probably want my SEC other teams to win when they play off conferences. Because, yeah, so I can see what you're saying is, if I'm a member of a conference, I probably, I'm against them when they're playing me, but I'm for them when they're playing somebody else outside of the conference. But I do think probably the driving force is money. And I think that's exactly why the Big Ten now goes coast to coast. They put in Rutgers, which is just outside of New York City. Now they have UCLA, which is Los Angeles. And I think they've gone coast to coast because they want to compete with the SEC and have as much money as they do.
I would just also comment, Pete, for Europeans and potentially South Americans, that this model and the data you have is also instructive. In particular, the European Union has this extremely unusual exception. There is no other sector in Europe where you can organize by country. And the idea that if a group of teams that is called La Liga would like to invite an English company to join their joint venture to offer a joint product, there is no other industry in Europe where you could get away with domestic leagues. If that were ever challenged, then you would see the same sort of different moves around that you're seeing in American college sports, where putting aside the whole Super League thing, but where La Liga might just decide to invite some English clubs to join them. And the top teams in Portugal and Denmark might get together, and you might see these sort of revisions that are currently precluded by UEFA because the European Court of Justice, for reasons it's never fully explained, thinks this is okay.
Now, didn't they recently try to put together a Super League?
Yeah, that's it. Right.
Yeah.
And that's also an interesting parallel to think about why that doesn't happen in the US. And I could talk a lot about to you as an American later. The Europeans are familiar with that. But one of the biggest problems with the Super League is that it was moving from the open league system to a guarantee system, whereas all of our leagues are guaranteed closed leagues. But it also has raised an interesting possibility for lessons, is what might happen in the US if nobody's going to do this voluntarily. But if Congress or somebody were to set up a situation where instead of having all these different conferences, we do have one championship conference, except the key feature is if you finish at the bottom of the conference, you automatically drop down to a lower tier, and then the best team in the lower conference would get
regulation. Oh, actually, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to
we
think of what
definitely
the
don't
parallel
have
was.
I'll say that
Relegation.
word wrong.
Yeah. I was trying to think, Steve, about what the parallel was about this affiliation to a college football team and I guess an NFL team, because it is the case here in England that people will follow their local non-league or lower league team and also have a Premier League team. So I know someone who'll support Chesterfield, but also Liverpool and Preston and Manchester United, teams like this, on the basis that they probably won't ever play each other. But of course, it's perfectly feasible that they will play each other. Whereas, as you say, the different national competitions around Europe is possibly about a better parallel to thinking about these conferences. Questions and comments, anyone? I guess a question stroke comment I had, Pete, was that you mentioned, obviously, you talked about competitive balance and that the reviewers have asked you to look at competitive balance, but you're looking at recruitment rather than competitive balance, if I understand it correctly. And so you're not actually saying much about competitive balance with your results.
No, I agree. That's pretty much why we left it out of the paper to begin with. But it was in our title, so I can't fault the referees to pointing that out. But mostly what we're saying is when it comes to recruitment, we don't expect competitive balance because the recruitment is in such a way. And I guess that's where I see the tie together. But the paper itself is about recruitment, not competitive balance. That's correct. Although I guess it has implications on competitive balance.
Yeah. And I guess that amateur stroke professional status is quite interesting as well as a dimension to this. Well, I guess there's a lot of competitions around the world, I guess, that are somewhere in between being amateur and being professional, or have been at different points in history. And this is quite interesting from that perspective in terms of the implications in terms of talent distribution.
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen in the U.S. since the Alston decision, because now they say you can pay players, and the NCAA has been a cartel. And I know that the name, image, and likeness is kind of the way they've been getting around it by just they've had these groups of individuals who donate money, and then I just pay a player, and then they maybe work for a charity by tweeting or posting on Facebook or whatever, and then they get paid for these posts. Ultimately, they're just getting paid because they're athletes, and so it's just gotten really. Somebody said it's become the Wild West in the sense you really don't know what's going to happen down the road. I mean, the conference realignments, and then the money paid, and like you said, even the transfers. It's the U.S. sports system is in flux, or when I say U.S. College sports system is in flux. Who knows where it's going to end up?
Are there any differences in terms of the style of play or anything on the field from between say college football and NFL that you observe that could be a function of the fact that there's a very different, I guess, payment system for players in the two competitions?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was listening to a podcast, and they said if you're a college student, you have much better facilities than if you're a professional. A professional has really bad facilities because the way I recruited you to come to my college is to give you unbelievably good facilities. But if you're a professional player, I don't need to give you good facilities because I pay you directly millions of dollars. So it's yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but they are very different in that sense. Because well, there's still I guess there's the free agency, but there's still the draft system that does diminish your power, at least initially. You're not a free agent right away when you go to the NFL.
Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
It was a pretty I guess it was quite a specific question. It was provoked by the fact that the way in which you're talking about these different ways to pay players reminds me a lot of the kind of the anecdotal stories when here in England there was a maximum wage and players could only be paid a certain amount of money. And that maximum wage was abolished in 1961. And the thing that I've observed that happened at that point was that teams suddenly quite dramatically changed how they set up to play football. They went from playing 5 attacking players to 2 quite quickly. And my guess is that that's because attacking players are more expensive. Before, they didn't have to pay as much of the market rate for these attacking players because the wages were being suppressed by the maximum wage. So I guess I wondered if there was a similar kind of parallel where attacking players are relatively cheaper in college football relative to NFL, perhaps.
I'm not. Well, there's the NFL. Well, I know, very few players from colleges move into the NFL, and I think that was where the big debate was. Is I might be a really good football player, and I generate a lot of revenues for the university, but I will never use those skills in the NFL because I'm not that good to go there. And a lot of people argue, well, that's why it's okay to pay these players at this level because they're generating revenues and they're not receiving, I guess you'd say, training that makes them better in the NFL because they won't make the NFL. I don't know if the playing is different between the two. I did see an article recently saying that the college quarterbacks are not that the skills in college do not transfer as well in the NFL. A lot of the best quarterbacks are really struggling in the NFL now because they're not being trained to follow the NFL type of quarterbacking, or the skills are not being generated in college like they once were. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all interesting to me. I mean, I'd always kind of naively assumed that everyone playing college football would go into the NFL, but I guess what you're saying is that only some proportion of players are good enough to
Yeah.
make it, and then presumably at the best colleges in these best conferences.
Yeah. A lot of times that's kind of also part of the story is if I'm a 5-star recruit, I want to go to the best college that can get me promoted into the pros. So that I go to the best schools with the best coaches, the best facilities, the most exposure. Because if I go to Alabama, people will say, "Hey, that player went to Alabama. They must be good enough to go into the NFL." I didn't even bring up any of that point, but I do know that that's part of the case as well.
Yeah. Any further questions and comments from people in the audience?
Well, thank you for the questions and the comments.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. Really interesting presentation. And we will be back next week when we have a slight change. So previously had in the lineup that Peter Pershakov will be presenting is their home advantage in esports. It will actually be his co-author that will be presenting, which is Mikhail Usanin. So we'll have next week a talk on esports, home advantage in esports, next Friday, same time as always. And I look forward to seeing you then and wish you all a great weekend in the meantime. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Pete, as well.